if I've never been depressed and I see someone who is depressed and acting this way, what I'm going to think is like, if I were acting that way, what would be going on inside me? It's like, I'm very depressed for 48 hours, but then if I go to a party, I'm having the time of my life and I feel fantastic. And the devastating thing about depression, more so than any other illness, is that it attacks your ability to fight back. If someone's really doesn't have a neurochemical depression, and like I start prescribing a bunch of medication, like I'm actually doing more harm than good, right? Because they're not gonna get any benefit from it. They're gonna suffer from side effects. They may do things like gain weight, have, sexual side effects and stuff like that. I'm actually doing them harm. So it's important to understand this.
You really think they're depressed? I mean, they walk around all day long, arguing, getting mad, yelling, cursing me out. He just gets to walk around and act like a jerk all day. It's just unbelievable. Seems like he just wants things handed to him. He expects people to just jump and do whatever he wants. I don't get it. Sleeps all day, he's up all night, he eats what he wants, total junk food. Can't lift a pencil to do his schoolwork. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. He's depressed. And that's what happens when you're depressed. You don't just get sad and down, you also get irritable and angry. Imagine living your life completely cut off from feelings like contentment, satisfaction, happiness, excitement, when all you can feel is irritation, anger, agitation, and nothing brings you relief. That's depression. And I know you got a lot of degrees and everything, but I don't know.
Yeah, so I think this is like a great representation of, and this guy's a psychologist, by the way. So like, I think it's a great representation of how hard it is for people who haven't experienced depression to understand depression. So what you see on the outside is the behaviors, right? And then what we naturally do when we see a behavior as human beings is we attribute our own experiences and internal environments and motivation to that behavior. And so that's what we assume the other person is thinking. So if they were like, if I've never been depressed and I see someone who is depressed and acting this way, what I'm going to think is like, if I were acting that way, what would be going on inside me? And they conclude like, if I was just like eating and sleeping, like I was sleeping whenever I want to, eating whatever I want to, being an asshole, like that would just be me being a lazy asshole. Because you haven't experienced depression, right? And so they like, if I was doing that, I would definitely be a lazy asshole. Because like when I have done those kinds of things, it has been closer to the lazy asshole. And they look at sometimes their child and they'll say like, oh my God, that's what they're doing too. But that's because they don't really understand that the internal experience is quite different. And I think this guy does a fantastic job of describing, I love the way he says, cut off from. So one of the key features of depression, clinical depression or major depressive disorder or a depressive episode, is anhedonia. So anhedonia is the inability to experience pleasure. So like literally what happens is there are activities, one of the key specific diagnostic questions of depression, right? If you're trying to figure out if someone has a major depressive disorder versus like narcissism and has had a narcissistic injury, is you ask them, are you able to enjoy things that you usually enjoy? And for people who have personality disorders, they can still enjoy stuff because their neurochemistry is like more normal, let's say. It's just a gross generalization, but so they can still like have a good time, which is why their depression fluctuates wildly. It's like, I'm very depressed for 48 hours, but then if I go to a party, I'm having the time of my life and I feel fantastic. More consistent with a personality disorder. So they're not actually anhedonic. But if you talk to the person with personality disorder and the person with a major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder, during the periods where they're depressed, their experience can be very similar. So anhedonia is one of the key features of like clinical depression. And that's the being cut off, essentially, from things that you enjoy. So what would your mood be like if you just couldn't have fun anymore? If there was a block on your ability to have fun, right? You may get irritable. You may get pissed. You may find yourself chasing after things that usually help you feel good, like eating like crap, right? You may also be getting physiologic reinforcement from some of those things that are not subjectively experienced. So when you eat, this is where, sometimes there are elements to this that are more physiologic. So for example, when I eat unhealthy food, even if my brain is unable to experience pleasure from it, there are going to be things like taste receptors and different kinds of like chemicals like leptin and ghrelin and stuff like that are going to get altered in a reinforcing way, even though I don't enjoy it. So that's why I do it if I don't enjoy it, right? Because there are other parts of you that are reinforcing that behavior. And so that's honestly a good representation. The other thing that I think a lot of people miss out on is that we shared this the other day, but if we look, there's actually, I'll find this again. What people don't realize is that for a third of people, depression manifests as anger. Okay, so we're going to just take a quick look at this paper. This is a really fascinating study. So by Maurizio Fava, who's I think now maybe Jerry or Maurizio, one of them is chief of psychiatry at Mass General Hospital. And what Maurizio did is he did a study looking at anger attacks and depression. And what he discovered was that approximately 1/3 of depressed outpatients present with anger attacks. So their primary experience of depression is not sadness, but is anger and irritability. And it's just something about the way that we're wired, which interestingly enough, Ayurveda makes predictions for. So we've steered clear of Ayurveda recently because we're just really evaluating the science. Some people in our community had some really good criticisms about the scientific nature or lack of scientific nature of Ayurveda. So we're kind of looking at that. But it's interesting because Ayurveda has been describing exactly this, right? So literally what Ayurveda has been saying is that a third of people will manifest with like periods of irritability. And they also called it a third because they're pitta depression. So there's a video about that if that, on Dr. K's Guide to Depression. But it's interesting that, 3,000, 4,000 years later, this guy publishes this paper that finds the exact same thing, which is why we sort of were supportive of it in the first place. But anyway, so it's very common that like a lot of people don't realize that depression can manifest as like being an ass. Now, the tricky thing, if we really want to complicate things, the tricky thing is that sometimes assholes will use depression as an excuse. So sometimes, and this is not uncommon actually, do they have depression? Sure. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have a subjective feeling of depression, but what they've learned to do is that depression essentially gets you some benefits, right? Like I don't have to do my chores if I'm depressed. And you may say like, oh, Dr. K, isn't that insensitive? Well, it's true, right? And it's important to recognize that as a mental health professional and as an individual, right? Because if someone's doesn't have a neurochemical depression and like I start prescribing a bunch of medication, like I'm actually doing more harm than good, right? Because they're not going to get any benefit from it. They're going to suffer from side effects. They may do things like gain weight, have, sexual side effects and stuff like that. I'm actually doing them harm. So it's important to understand this. It's really interesting. So there's something called pseudo seizures or non-epileptiform seizures. So this is like seizure-like movements that are not actually caused by electrical activity in the brain. So generally speaking, when we have a seizure, what it means is that we have unregulated electrical activity in the brain, right? So our like motor cortices are like firing off. And so then as a result, we'll like literally seize, okay? So it's epilepsy. It's electrical activity in the brain that's causing you to move. So there's also seizure-like behavior, which are called pseudo seizures, which are when someone does this. We'll see this sometimes on TikTok as well, where someone does this kind of stuff, but it's not a seizure. It's not actually like there's electrical activity in the brain that is out of control. So that's called a pseudo seizure. Now, what's really interesting is that 50% of the people who have pseudo seizures also have real seizures. It's an alarmingly high comorbidity. So they'll have real seizures and quote unquote fake seizures, or non-epileptiform seizures is what we call it. And then the question becomes, why is that? It's because human beings are adaptable. So what someone with epilepsy learns, right, like subconsciously, what they learn is that when I have a seizure, there are particular advantages to it, right? Like people will do stuff for me. People will demonstrate compassion. They will care about me. I don't have to do as much work. I get extensions on my deadlines. And then the brain is smart. So what the brain realizes is like, cool. Like if I need to get out of something, I've got an ace in the hole. And it's really devastating. Hopefully I'm not, being insensitive here, but this is just medical fact. The comorbidity of pseudoseizures and seizures is really high in that direction, but not 50. It's not 50% of real people who have epileptiform seizures develop pseudoseizures. That's not the statistic. It's 50% of people who have pseudoseizures also have epilepsy. So it goes one way, not both ways, if that makes sense, if you guys understand, like biostatistics. And so that's what happens. So we see this with mental health too, where some people will genuinely have mental illness and they will use that mental illness as an excuse, which is how people work, right? And so oftentimes what we tend to see is that people who have pseudoseizures, they'll send them to a psychiatrist, which they absolutely hate, by the way. The patients hate it. But what we tend to find is that the pseudoseizures are serving a function. They're helping people cope, communicate, or get something that they need. They're getting their needs met through their pseudoseizure-like activity. And if you teach them how to get their needs met in other ways, the pseudoseizures will go down. Now, for people to say, oh, it's fake, why are you putting up with it? It's not that simple, right? So like, is it fake? Yeah. I mean, it's not epileptiform, but it's really coming from a very genuine place. And it doesn't help to call it out. It doesn't, actually makes things worse, right? So you have to understand that people are going to do what they need to get their needs met, right? So it's interesting. So I've seen this a lot where there's like, what is that fake disorder, cringe or something? Where it's like, people are, it's a lot more, like it's really easy to judge on the internet. Like look at someone and be like, oh my God, this guy's like so terrible person. And it's like, sure, there may be an element of that's true, but it's complicated. People who have pseudoseizures, or as people put it, fake disorders, they're not necessarily bad people. Are they making things more complicated? Sure. Is it sometimes very insensitive to people who are actually like have an epileptic condition? Absolutely. So there are criticisms to be made, but there's also like some amount of understanding to be had, right? There's some amount of compassion and like people don't just wake up one day and like, I'm gonna pretend to be mentally ill. Like think about what your life would have to be like in order to do that. So what I personally seen is that trauma is like the biggest thing that makes me think about this stuff. So it captures very, 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 very quickly one of the biggest problems with depression. So internally, I made this connection. I don't really share it publicly because I think it comes with connotations that are probably not good to share. But when I was training to become a psychiatrist, I realized one day, in my mind, I made this connection that depression is almost the HIV of mental illness. Now, there's a lot of things that are problematic with that comparison, so don't hold me to that, but here's the connection that I made. It's just like my neurons formed this thing. So the reason that HIV is so devastating is because it attacks your ability to fight back. And the devastating thing about depression, more so than any other illness, is that it attacks your ability to fight back. Right? So like it's one thing to be suicidal, but it's another thing to deserve that you want to die, or that you deserve to die. So you can see suicidality, for example, in schizophrenia, right? And even if you see suicidality in schizophrenia, the reason they're suicidal is because they're suffering so much. It's not that they deserve to die. It's that they're being tracked. The devil is like hunting them. The FBI is following them. You'll see like all these kind of delusional kind of thinking. And so like the only escape that you have is death. But even in that moment, if I talk to someone who has a psychotic disorder, hopefully, and I sort of say like, hey, if I can like make all this stuff go away, would you want to live? And they'd say like, yes, absolutely. It's been my experience anyway. But in depression, your mind is working against you. And so it handicaps your ability to fight back. So the more that you struggle, right, like you get all these weird paradoxical responses that keep you from getting better. So like no one cares about you. That's what your mind tells you, right? Like I need help, but no one cares about you. Paradoxically, we see this even with mental health professionals. When I have a patient who's got depression who stops showing up at my office, I get really worried. Right? Because like, and even afterward, like I'll talk to them. I mean, thankfully things have gone generally well. I've been pretty lucky and my patients have been quite resilient. They'll come to me and they'll be like, I was thinking like, I didn't want to disappoint you. Really common one. Because I did so well. I was doing so well for like 12 months, 14 months. Like we're meditating, we're doing yoga, we're putting in all this effort. And you're such a good doctor, you care so much. And like, as I got sick, I realized like, it must be me. And I was so ashamed to come because it means that like, even you can't help me. And I didn't want to disappoint you. Happens so much. Such a big problem as a therapist. That your patients want you to respect them. They want you to be proud of them. They want the treatment to work. You're working hard, they're working hard, you care so much. You deserve to have a triumph as a treater. So the patient prioritizes your feelings over their own. They feel doubly worse. So when they should come to the office, they don't. And if y'all are sitting at home skipping therapy appointments, you should absolutely go. I can't guarantee you, but I feel very confident that if you have a halfway decent therapist, they will not be disappointed if you get sick. In fact, they're the ones who understand that it comes and goes. Being depressed is not a personal failing, right? That's the biggest problem, is that like clinicians understand that, whereas patients don't. People don't. Especially when the depression strikes, because when the depression strikes, your brain is blaming you. So even if intellectually you understand that it's not your fault, but your brain is going to be blaming you for whatever it can. Oh yeah. If you were a better patient, you wouldn't be so depressed. If you had done more yoga, if you had done more meditation. It's always there pointing the finger at you, right? No one else's fault, all your fault. And even says crazy thoughts. Like people would be better without you. Like, can you imagine how bad your doctor feels when you come in week after week after week and don't get better? You do the world a favor by helping your doctor help someone else who deserves to be helped. These are all the crazy thoughts it sends you. And that's what I mean when I say it's like the HIV of mental illness. Like it attacks you on such a fundamental level that it makes everything your fault. You can't fight back. And then you retreat from the very things that you need. The other thing that it kind of just reminded me of in this moment is something like rabies, where like the more dehydrated you are, you're afraid of water, and that which will save you, you want to run away from. And so that's why it's so devastating. But it's really important to understand this. That like the whole point is that in depression, your mind is always going to be telling you that it's your fault. And that's why it's weird, but you have to learn to distrust the mind. Right? A healthy amount of distrust of your own mind is good. It's part of yoga. It's the recognition that your mind is not an arbiter of truth or reality. It's just your mind. It's full of cognitive biases. And so that's where sometimes even on stream and stuff, we'll try to point out to people how their mind works. It's not a clinical intervention. It's just like everyone should understand. What is my mind doing now? Why is it doing that? What are the patterns of my mind? What does it learn how to do? And as you learn the patterns of your mind, hopefully you will gain the ability to overcome it. Right? And for people who are saying distrust, I'm not saying 100%. I'm saying be skeptical. Because your mind, I know it's kind of weird. Let's think about this for a second. Your mind has the capacity to be wrong. Right? So you shouldn't trust it 100%. It's right most of the time. But it's really, really important for you to understand which of the thoughts are wrong. As Bashwick is saying, not my mind. Where did that thought come from? It's funny, I know you're joking, but that's actually what happens in depression. Is the mind tells you, no, I'm 100% correct. I know you have some thoughts that make you think that your family love you, but no, listen to me. Listen to me. I'm the one who's looking out for you. So it's hard. Really hard. What if my thinking about flawed thinking is flawed? Very good question. This is why you need to do jnana yoga And as Patanjali put it, there's two kinds of knowledge, right knowledge and wrong knowledge.